My name is Kelly. I am one of the pastors here at Real Life Church. So if you're new with us, welcome to our little church family here. And we are talking about character. We're in a series called Character. We're also having an important conversation as a church right now, which really I think tells a lot about who we are and who we want to be. Last week, the elders, I am not one of the elders, but the elders made an announcement that we amended our bylaws to include women into leadership positions in all areas of the church. And this is a topic that kind of scares me, to be honest with you. I've talked on it for over a decade, taught on it in multiple ways, and it's been a fluid approach, I think, through the whole thing. And it's not scary because I'm not convicted over this issue or whatnot, but it's scary because I've seen some of the worst in humanity come out over this topic. It is so loaded in politics, it's loaded in tradition, it's loaded in just passionate opinion. I can't tell you the emails I've received because they're inappropriate to share in church over the years. It is a topic that brings a lot of emotion, and I really, what we're doing here is just having a conversation more than anything. I just want to explore what Scripture says. We do the same thing every single Sunday, and we're not doing anything different here. And honestly, I'm really happy that we're a church that isn't afraid to talk about these things or isn't afraid to explore these things, and even though some of them are controversial. And so I'm excited that you're on this journey with us as we explore this conversation today, because we are going to be talking about what I think is probably the most controversial passage in the entire New Testament. So welcome to church, right? I think it could be a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find it interesting, because I find it interesting. I think this is an interesting conversation to have with people. And again, we're going to find disagreement here, and that is okay. In fact, I think that's good. We're not a church that shoots for uniformity, but unity in oneness in Jesus. And so if you've never seen this perspective before, or this is new information for you, I just invite you to sit with it. Let it challenge you. I think we do that with any scripture we do, that it should challenge how we think and how we live our lives. And so I invite you to look at that with us today. If you missed last week, I did you can see the announcement from the elders if you want. I also go into a message that talks about temptations around this topic, assumptions that are often made, and do an invitation. So you can go back and watch that on our YouTube page if you want to catch up. But today we're just going to go straight into it. I have a lot to cover. Carissa was gracious enough to just do 2 songs today to give me more time to get into it. And I'm telling you right now, this is going to be a meaty sermon. All right, this is a prime rib. Okay, you're getting what a lot of seminary classes are like. Going through seminary is a lot like what we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. And before we dive into it, I feel like I should give you some background as we're going to be jumping in kind of mid through it. So 1 Timothy was written by Paul to his young pupil. Can you guess his name? Timothy. There you go. In the 1st century AD, so mid-1st century AD, maybe 30 years after the resurrection of Jesus. The purpose of the letter was mainly to help Timothy prevent the spread of false teaching by Ephesian men and women. So there is a rampant amount of false teaching going on in the church of Ephesus, and so Paul has commissioned this young Timothy to go in and bring correction, and he's giving insight into how to bring correction. So this is really important into the context of what we're going to be reading, is we need to see it through the environment that there's rampant false teaching going on, both men and women. In fact, we get a couple of male names that Paul will actually remove from the community because of the false teaching. And the men, of course, are angry, quarreling over these teachings. And so we have a lot of anger and emotion. Well, we can't really relate to that, can we, around disagreements? That's a foreign concept to us, isn't it? Of course not. And so with all of that in mind, that brings us into our passage today. So if you'll follow along with me, let me just read this. 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or dispute. I also want the women to dress modestly, respectful, with self-control, adorning themselves not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good works, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman must learn in quietness and submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue with faith, love, and holiness with self-control. You guys see what I'm talking about? It's got some stuff in there we got to talk about, right? I think most people hear that, they have a different range of emotions around this. And I want to start off with how we think about interpreting a passage like this, because what often happens in conversing about topics or passages like this one is you hear people kind of emphasize the idea of clearly. Clearly the Bible teaches whatever that might be. In this case, it might be clearly the Bible teaches women can't be teachers or leaders in the church because that would require them to have authority over men. So clearly it says that, and I'm not disagreeing with that. It is clear. But is that really the best way to think about interpreting this passage? Because the goal of any interpretation is to be consistent. This is really important. Anytime we open the Bible, think about this. Does our interpretation, is it consistently applied in how we interpret it through Scripture? We must find consistency. And I think the best way to find consistency is by context. When we read Scriptures through context, we find a way to evaluate things consistently. We do this when we read emails at work. We do this when we talk about things with each other. Consistency is supreme, or context is supreme, and we find that through consistency. The reason is that because we are not the original audience. This was not written to us today. We are not the first ones to hear this 2,000 years ago. This was at a particular importance within the Ephesian context and to Timothy that we must look at and evaluate and work really hard to figure out what that is. One of the best New Testament scholars, probably of our generation, I really mean this, his name was Dr. Gordon Fee. He says this: a text cannot mean what it could never have meant for its original audience. Right? So a text cannot mean what it never could mean to its original audience. We have to transport ourselves back 2,000 years ago and go, how would an Ephesian think about this? Or how would Timothy think about this within the Ephesian context? And to give you a bit of a hermeneutical lesson, hermeneutics is just the science of interpretation, kind of the 101s. You know, the Bible is made up of different languages. So we're not the original language. It's not English. Hopefully that's not a surprise to you. But it's made up in Hebrew, Aramaic. In this case, it's Koine Greek, a kind of a street Greek, a slang Greek. It's not the refined Greek. It's the common man's tongue of the time. And we got to think about any translation of these languages is an act of interpretation. Okay, so anytime we are translating something from one language to another, we have to interpret what those words mean, which plays a significant part in this conversation. We have to look at the cultural context. You know, what did this mean to the original audience? How did this speak to them within their particular culture? We have to look at historical context. Why was this significant at the time? Why was this a significant thing to say? Why is Paul saying this to this particular moment in time? And the literary context, how was it supposed to be understood? How was it supposed to be understood? Because we really need to think about this one, because Jesus speaks a lot in hyperbole, if you're not familiar with some of his teachings. One of his most famous hyperboles is if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out. The Bible clearly teaches us, right, that Jesus says to gouge out your eye if your right eye causes you to stumble. Now, nobody does that because we understand the literary context, right? And I can remember as a young 21, 22-year-old in seminary on my little seminary soapbox, right? And I'm like, Dad, I was talking to my dad, pastor for 50 years. What would it be like if we just took the Bible literally? Oh, I'm so frustrated. And he kind of in his calm dad presence, says, well, son, there'd be a lot of one-eyed Christians in the world, And it was a total like, oh, I've got to rethink my entire life. It was the perfect dad line at the right time. And let's use a fun example of why this is important, because the Bible clearly says to greet one another with a holy kiss. In fact, it says it 5 times. So it says it a lot. Yeah, woo, thank you. This is an introvert's nightmare, isn't it? Imagine coming to church and the first thing you see is Dan Huber giving you a kiss at the front door. Right? There he is. He's ready. Right? People would probably flee out the parking lot if that was the expectation, right? And so why don't we clearly take this in the literal? Well, we know there's a cultural dynamic to this. We take the context, we understand this was a different cultural greeting than what we might do now. We might use the principle of that. We take it out and say, well, let's greet each other warmly. Let's greet each other with a hug, a side hug, a high five, a handshake. We take the principle of it and we apply it into our lives. We don't literally grab it and go, the Bible clearly says I have to kiss you and it has to be holy. It would just be a very uncomfortable situation. So we should think about this passage in the same way. right? And really any passage in Scripture the same way. And this is exactly what we do here at Real Life Church. Our sermon prep teams, we just think about context. We use hermeneutics. We do all of this every single week. We're not doing anything different than we've done ever since we got here, and even before I got here. Because in this passage, there's 5 clear statements, right? 1, men are to pray with lifted hands, without anger or dispute. Women are to dress modestly with respect, self-control in a way that professes their worship of God, which means no braided hair, no expensive jewelry like gold, pearls, and no expensive clothes. Right? A woman must learn. This is the imperative within the text. This is the only line that has the imperative mood, the command phrase within the text. And then 4, the verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And then 5, which is often just omitted a lot of times, women are saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Now, there's 5 clear statements in this passage. So why do people join, dissuade people from, or leave churches based off one of those rather than all 5 of those? This is kind of my pet peeve with this passage. Because one of them, verse 12, becomes the clear, literal application, and the other 4 are kind of dismissed. Because I don't know anybody who gets upset by saying, hey, your church doesn't have men raising hands when they pray. I've never gotten that email, okay? I've never seen people leave churches because the Bible's clear that women shouldn't wear jewelry or have braided hair. I've never seen people get upset about that. In fact, I think braided hair in our age is a bit of a form of modesty. So it's kind of turned itself upside down a little bit. We don't teach that women are clearly saved through childbearing, do we? How many of you believe that your salvation is tied, women, to your ability to give birth? Hopefully none of you, right? So here is the problem with the interpretation that we often do, is we take 12 literally and we dismiss the other 3 as cultural dynamics pertaining to a particular time and place within the Ephesian church. Now, that doesn't mean we just dismiss it and we throw it out and we just say that doesn't matter to us, because there are important principles that we draw from these texts that apply to us today. But we do look at it through the cultural dynamics, just like we do greet one another with a holy kiss. We do the same exact thing. We cannot step into what's called selective literalism, where we get to choose what we apply literally and what we don't. This was a tactic used in the 19th century to justify slavery in the South, was using passages selectively to try to justify their usage of slavery, which soon became obsolete, thankfully. The abolitionists absolutely were going after the dignity of the dignity of a Genesis 1 idea of God, everyone's created in the image of God. And this is what we're doing here. So we cannot step into selective literalism. We don't want to dismiss these passages. We want to discover the driving principle behind them. So that's what I'm going to advocate we do today. Let's get into it. You guys ready? All right, so let's look at verse 11. A woman must learn in quietness and in submission. A lot of times you see that as should, but I put it a must because I think it captures the imperative behind this, what Paul's really trying to communicate with imperative. And I think this is the crux. Like, we should really view everything through this line in verse 11. A woman must learn. And if you're not familiar with this text, this can be a pretty jaunting text because you're thinking of words like quietness, submission, and you start to think about modern context of those types of usages. But again, this is a radical statement that I think often is overlooked in this passage, because this is probably the most controversial thing Paul said to his original audience. This is extremely countercultural to the original audience of Paul's day. Not necessarily to ours, but to theirs. And so to know that, we have to look at how women were looked at in the first century. And I have a couple of examples here. If you're looking at the Jewish context, we have a rabbi named Eliezer writing at the same time of Paul. He says this: rather should the word of the Torah be burned than entrusted to a woman. They weren't learning. Women in the first century Jewish world were not learning. We don't have any examples of women disciples outside of the disciples of Jesus. He's the only rabbi that we know of who has women students. Like, if you're looking at the Greco-Roman culture, most of their influence of society and the way they govern themselves was influenced by a famous philosopher named Aristotle. You guys heard of him, Aristotle? He wrote a book called Politics, and it kind of gives an idea of what the city is supposed to be governed by. And the Greek idea of human anatomy with male and femaleness is pretty skewed. In fact, if you read it, you'd probably be deeply offended by it. But he says this about the nature of men and women. He says, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules and the other is ruled. And so you have this kind of natural approach to what Aristotle does. And this is a big influence in most of the Greco-Roman culture. In fact, if you're really bored and you're looking for more reading to read at night, there's a guy named Lloyd P. Gerson. He wrote a book called The Cambridge History of Philosophy in Late Antiquity. I think it's interesting, but it could be pretty dry for some of you. But he says this: Aristotle's views on women, that they were inferior to men in both nature and in the existence of virtue, had a significant influence on later philosophical and social thought. His emphasis on the hierarchical nature of gender, where men were seen as superior and women as naturally subordinate, was absorbed into many aspects of Greco-Roman culture, particularly in how women were expected to behave and their roles in society. And this is just a classical approach. This isn't even a Christian. He's writing about the classical ideas of Aristotle, right? And this is a big influence within Paul's day, and I think it's a huge influence in the Greco-Roman societies for the next 100 years after Paul. So within this culture, this is the fun part, within this culture is birthed the Jesus movement. So within this type of thought is birthed the Jesus movement. And then you have stories where Jesus sits alone and instructs a woman at John 4. And you see the disciples are shocked by this. I can't believe he's talking to this woman. Women are sitting at the feet of Jesus, learning as his disciples in Luke 10. Again, a shocking countercultural thing that Jesus did. They were among the 72 disciples sent out by Jesus to prepare the way for him in Luke 10. There were women at the Great Commissioning where Jesus tells his disciples to go and make disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in Matthew 28. There are women in the upper room in Acts 2 where the Holy Spirit descends on them, launching the Jesus movement itself. The Jesus movement is countercultural to the first century idea of what it looks like to be a woman. Jesus broke through the cultural restrictions that prohibited women from learning the scriptures, from being disciples of a rabbi, and he sent them out to preach and teach the good news. We have examples of this not only in the Bible, but in the early years of the church. He advocated for women to be elevated into positions that were normally only reserved to men, and broke through some of the social stigmas, like women shouldn't be educated outside of the domestic sphere, which is really a lot of Aristotle's context. His idea is let's just teach them as much as they need to run the house. Don't worry about what it means to govern a city. So we see a radically different approach, the way of Jesus, that I think is carried over in Paul. And this is why this is such a radical thing when he uses the emphatic to say women must learn. This would have shocked the audience and the culture. It was a scandal. One of my favorite things, I didn't put this in my notes, so I might butcher it, but there was a Roman emperor named Julian the Apostate. You can tell he's not a good dude by that name, right? Julian the Apostate. Christian converts back to Roman paganism. And he talks about how it was the kind of the weakness of the Christian faith is that it has women teachers. He was like, what a scandal, what a radical thing to have these Christians who teach and allow women to teach. And he says here in quietness and submission, quiet here is not never speak, but to be calm. To be calm. I think a good way to think about it is listening with intent. You know, again, imagine Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's not quiet. She's not disruptive. She's quietly at the feet of Jesus, listening and learning from her rabbi. He uses the same word in the same chapter, just above this passage, to talk about how we are calm under the governmental authorities, that we should pray for peace and calmness within our societies rather than maybe we're causing riots and havoc. Good students, he says, listen when they're being instructed. And that leads us into submission. Now, submission, again, is another loaded word with tons of modern contextual baggage that we bring into it. You might be thinking of someone in authority who's just trying to oppress, or someone who is trying to tell somebody to sit down and shut up kind of a mentality. That is not what the biblical idea of submission is whatsoever. That's kind of our modern experiential idea of submission. And I think to understand the character behind what it means to be in submission, we need to look at the dynamics that are at play in this word. Because there's those who teach this in a way that if you look at it from a way that restricts all women from any church leadership, you have to kind of evaluate submission through church authority, i.e. the elders. And I get that. That's not a super far stretch considering the next chapter is talking about elders, which we'll look at next week. So I don't think that's a super far stretch, but is that necessary, that what he means by submission? There's a Greek scholar. Now, if you took any type of Greek literature or Greek class in the last 30 years, you used Bill Mounce's textbook. He is probably the most, the most fluent and probably the most popular Greek teacher in our generation, or at least for the last 30 years. That's who I used. And he wrote a commentary on 1 Timothy. It took him about 10 years to write it. 10 years to write it. And then he did an interview recently where he realizes, I think I got it wrong, which makes me feel a lot better about myself, right? If one of the best Greek speakers and Greek thinkers can take 10 years to write a commentary and then afterwards go, I think I got it wrong, I feel pretty good about my approach here. But this is what he says. He says, when talking about women in Ephesian leadership, Paul starts by saying a woman should learn in quietness and in all submissiveness. But submissive to whom? In my commentary, I focus on the object of women's submissiveness. Submissive to whom? Submissive to her husband? Submissive to every man? Absolutely not. Robin, my wife, is never required to be submissive to any one man. Submissive to all men? Absolutely not. Submissive to the elders? That was my conclusion. I was always uncomfortable with that conclusion since it isn't what the text actually says. Maybe what Paul is requiring is a submissive character. Many, if not most, of the other instructions to women have to do with their character. This is why we're talking about this through the category of character. Again, here's a scholar devoted 10 years of his life to write a commentary, knows Greek probably better than anybody we know in this time, and yet he is saying, I got it wrong. He thinks a good way to think about submission is how we character our lives around prioritizing others and the pursuit of truth. Submission is really a form of prioritization rather than oppression. This is a key characteristic trait of every servant of Jesus. Every servant that follows Jesus has a submissive character in the sense that we prioritize the truth and we prioritize one another over ourselves. This is what biblical submission is. He calls the entire church to this in Ephesians 5:21. He says, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for Christ. Prioritize one another out of honoring of Christ. Submission is not a bad word. It's actually a very key characteristic of what it means to follow Jesus. And we build character when we prioritize one another above ourselves. Quietness and submission is about learning the true instruction in a world of false teaching and prioritizing how we put it into practice. Again, the posture of any disciple or any student of Jesus. Paul's commission to Timothy, which we see in verse 3 of chapter 1, says, command certain people, again, men and women, not to teach false doctrines or devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. This is his solution. Not, let's kick them out of the entire body. He says, you got to teach them, Timothy. I'm going to command them to learn. Teach them. They've never been given the opportunity to teach, or if they have, they've learned the wrong things. This is deeply influential within the Ephesian church and pertinent to the Ephesian church and to us today. Again, this is only accomplished if Timothy and other teachers teach these women who are promoting false doctrine and learn to change their behavior. This is the imperative. Everything we read moving forward should be seen through this particular verse. In the next verse, he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, not permitting these women to teach, I think, is a pretty logical request, considering he just said, hey, you need to teach them, right? We don't do anything like, we practice this at RLC where we would never ask somebody who is just learning or isn't learning to come up here and teach. I would never do that. We have a pretty high bar when it comes to who we ask to come and teach. They have to have spent a lot of time learning and understanding what the scriptures teach. So we do that today. I think that's a very logical connection in the passage. But what does he mean by assume authority? This is where you'll see the most pen on paper in the conversation, is what is he talking about with assuming authority? What type of authority is he prohibiting these women to wield in the church in Ephesus? And again, when we think of Paul's words, assume authority, we also assume many things about that word, because we really don't have a lot of words for authority. But Greek has many ways of using it. Many ways of using it. And in fact, Greek language, oftentimes there's a positive and a pejorative form of it. We see it with kings. You have like a king, what's called a basileus, and then you have a tyrant, right? Both can be in the same position, but have different dynamics. And we see the same thing with authority here. The word here that is used for assume authority is the Greek word authentane, authenteo or authentane. Authentane is the infinitive form of that word. And it's a very rare word. It has about 12 different ranges of meaning, which just makes it really easy. It's really not easy to settle down, right? It's a very difficult word to kind of nail down what it means. And this is the only place that Paul uses the word, which makes it even more difficult, because we can't go to other Pauline usages and go, oh, that's what he meant here, so it probably means it here. So we have to look outside of the New Testament to go, how are other people using this word, and figure out what this means. This is what we do in word studies. And he could have used a lot of different varieties of words here. He could have used the word exousia. Exousia, this is the normal function of authority. This is what's used over 100 times in the New Testament. It's a very common word. It usually means divine authority, rightful authority, Jesus authority. This is the word Jesus uses when he says, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. This is a good, proper form of authority, commonly used. He uses the word huperoke for authority to the government in the same chapter. Huperoke. This is a type of hierarchical authority or supreme authority, or you might even say preeminent authority. Huperoke, used a few times in the New Testament, maybe 2 or 3 times, not very often either. But he doesn't use these words. And I think if he does use these words, my conclusion is very different. I don't know if I think the way I think if he uses these words. Authenteo is a strange word. And the question about this word, and this is where this sermon gets super nerdy, so hang on with me, okay? Is this word a positive dynamic or a pejorative, negative dynamic? And this is where the debate sits. Is he talking about positive authority like exousia, or something more negative, like there's a Greek word that Jesus uses and 1 Peter uses, and I always butcher it, but it's kataruko. Kataruko, it means a lordship over. So when Jesus is talking about how we don't lord over one another, that's the word kataruko. When 1 Peter's talking about the elders of the church, and he's using the word kataruko to say you do not rule over or oppress those who are apart. You be like the good shepherd. And so we have to think, is it closer to kataruko or is it closer to exousia? And this is where the debate sits. So let's look at the positive approach. Those who assume it's a positive form of authority advocate for universal restriction of women in church leadership. It's kind of thought of as women are disrupting the rightful and divine authority of men that they have in the leadership of the church. Scholars like George W. Knight III, which is probably the most theological name I've ever read if you are a theologian, Al Walters, Andreas Kirstenberger, Wayne Grudem all advocate for this position, as well as many more. And the majority of their research spans from the 1980s up to early 2000s. And they probably review collectively together well over 80 citations or usages of the word authentane and its various cognates. The noun form is authentase, so it comes from that word authentase. Okay? And their work is probably the largest influencer of those who would restrict women in church leadership. So these are kind of the thought process behind how we assume authority or exercise authority would probably be how they would look at it. The problem with this, in my mind, is their research heavily focuses on later usages of the word, even hundreds of years after 1 Timothy is written. And as you understand language, if you kind of study language, you know that it evolves. It changes, right? And this word is one that has deep change over the years. I mean, from an etymology standpoint and how words are developed, this is where we get the word authentic from, not authority. We get the word authentic from the Greek word authentane. Our word authority comes from a Latin verb that's completely different. And so this is more, the way that words change, it can mean authentic in our language today. Al Walters, who again is probably one of the best scholars around this approach, he even admits this in his writings. He says, the meaning that's assigned to the verb 1 Timothy 2:12, have authority over, is based primarily on the verb's later usage, on the meaning of its cognates, and on the ancient versions of the biblical verse. So this is like the late church fathers' writings that are hundreds of years apart from Paul. Dr. Philip Payne, another New Testament author, he agrees with this. He says, not even one instance of later ecclesiastical or church use of authenteo with the meaning to have authority over, exercise authority, has been established before or near the time of Paul. And when you're doing a word study, it's really important that you understand how the word is being used in that time. And we understand that. Words that we have said in the 90s are not the same we might use today in 2025. Okay, they're going to have different meanings. People give words meaning, not words themselves. So that turns us into the pejorative side. Okay, so what is the negative approach to authority? Well, kind of the key figure on the negative side is a guy named Dr. Leland E. Wilshire. He conducted the largest and most comprehensive study of authenteo that we have in 2010, so fairly recent compared to some other ones. He samples 306 citations, so far more data space, and he focuses within the first 200 years, or they're 200 BCs all the way up to 480, so a more concise 400-year span. So more citations with a more concise time. Paul's writing right in the middle of that, okay? And this is what his conclusion was. He says, the preponderant number of citations from this compilation have to do with the self-willed violence, criminal action, or murder or reference to the person who does these actions. This is a pejorative way of understanding it. This is negative. It's reserved for those who are murderers and have evil intent. He says, by the time of Paul, the term was still not commonly used for neutral or legitimate authority, as it is later in history. The evidence suggests that its meaning in 1 Timothy 2:12 is closer to assume authority over or dominate rather than exercise authority in the way that some have agreed. And so he's talking about how it's much closer to the idea of kataruko, domination, than it is exousia in this passage. I find this research very compelling, especially because I do a lot of word studies, and I know how hard it is to find words usage in the very time frame of those using it. So what does it mean if it's negative? What does that word mean? Well, thankfully, a lot of smarter people than I have translated a lot of Greek literature from the first century. And one of them that is kind of the biggest in my mind was written by a guy named Philo Judaea. He was a first century Jewish writer in Alexandria, Egypt. And he wrote an allegorical work called On the Posterity of Cain and the Exile, and his exile. And it was written comparing false teachers, or of what's called false knowledge. That's how the Bible kind of talks about it, in one way at least. He kind of connects that idea of teaching false knowledge to the person of Cain, which is the first murderer, or what you might call authentes in Genesis. And Paul uses that same word for false knowledge in chapter 6 of 1 Timothy, so we know he's talking about similarities here. So what's really interesting, though, is it's a really strong parallel because we have someone from the same century, writing in the same cultural context, talking about the same contextual things when it comes to the importance of addressing and correcting false teaching. Philo uses authentes. Now, this is the noun cognate of authenteo, so this is the noun version of the verb. He says a few times in the context of how Cain embraced false knowledge of God. He comments on how false teachings lead to our own destruction and those of our posterity. So if you know the story of Cain, his deception carried over for generations to come through deceitful and immoral practices. Again, another ancient scholar named Dr. David T. Runia, he wrote a book on Philo of Alexandria, a bibliography, and this is what he has to say. And again, this isn't the context of this passage at all. He's just talking about Philo in general. He says, in Philo's thought, the authentes is not merely a figure of authority, but one who assumes it without justification. In the realm of knowledge, this self-appointed authority corrupts true wisdom and leads others into error. For Philo, as for the Hellenistic thinkers, the claim to possess special knowledge without genuine grounding is inherently problematic and perilous to both the individual and the community. This fits surprisingly well with the context of 1 Timothy and gives us a lot of traction on what we can think about with the word authentane. So here's what I think authentane means. To authentane means to wield authority or mastery in a destructive way that is harmful to others and how it corrupts true wisdom and leads the community into error. It's a type of mastery over someone that actually is self-harmful, harmful to others, and a lot of it's through false knowledge of God. We might call it abusive authority. We might call it toxic authority. We would call it domination. It's a pejorative. And I think Paul uses it in the pejorative because his contemporaries are using it in the pejorative. What connects false teaching with abusive or toxic authority is the type of character that it develops. And I think we see this today when it's exercised within relationship. A false knowledge of God can and probably will lead to a toxic form of authority. How often do we see that wielded in churches today? How many times do we read about it when we have people who have a false knowledge of God wielding authority in an improper way, this is what I think what Paul would say is this is authentane. This is authenteo. If you use a later source by an early church father, John Chrysostom, he's writing a commentary on Colossians, and he uses the word in a pejorative way as well. He says, a husband should not authentia his wife. It's the same word, different conjugation. He talks about ruling tyrannically. A husband should never rule tyrannically over his wife, right? This is, again, another example that we can learn from. And I would say no man or woman should ever teach or have authority this way, wouldn't you? I don't think this is just a woman thing. This is an everybody thing, that no character of a servant of Jesus should ever wield power this way. Paul doesn't want these particular women in Ephesus who were deceived promoting these teachings, further resulting in their harming others, themselves, and the men in the church. I can't see this as a universal prohibition because of this against all women. I think it really is more of a universal understanding that we have to be careful in how we succumb to the false knowledge or false teachings of God and encourage one another to learn. That be the imperative. We must encourage each other to learn so we're not deceived. And then he leads into an illustration here. He says in verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. I think illustrating this very important point. This is an illustration about what happens to those who don't submit to the learning of the truth and prioritizing it in their life. If you do not learn in quietness and submission, this is the result. Adam, the first formed, represents the teacher of the divine command. Remember, God spoke to him directly before Eve was formed. He was formed first. The divine command was not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, right? He wasn't deceived. The Genesis story isn't that Adam was deceived. He partook because he desired it, right? He desired, but he wasn't the one deceived. In fact, Eve will say that the serpent deceived me, but Adam never says that. Eve here represents the deceived. In this case, the women of Ephesus, or really anybody who's deceived, who weren't learning. And just as Eve was deceived by the false knowledge of God, that false knowledge of, hey, God's really holding out on you. Don't you want your own wisdom? That's kind of the deception of the serpent here, to paraphrase. These women are being deceived into sin and passing it on to their husbands, which is exactly what happens, isn't it? Eve partakes and passes it to her husband. It's exactly what Genesis teaches us, causing harm and corruption. Exactly what authentase is. So Eve is sitting as the authentase, performing authentane on her husband, is the way that Paul is using this illustration. This isn't the only place that in Scripture that Paul used this illustration. In 2 Corinthians 11:3, he says this about the entire church of Corinth. He says this to him, but I'm afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may be corrupted from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So in Paul's mind, anyone who is falling into deception, being led astray mentally from devotion to Christ, is like Eve. And he says, you cannot be like Eve. Do not be deceived by the false teachings of this world. Paul used this illustration to emphasize the importance of learning, a radical statement in its time, so we're not deceived like Eve, and how what we learn about God truly matters in the relationships of the community. What we learn about God, his character, reflects our character and how we relate to one another and how we lead and worship Christ. So sisters, this isn't an ontological statement about women. I don't think it is. I don't think it's explaining a particular unique function of women. There's nothing about your femininity that makes you more gullible or easier to deceive. And I heard some pretty radical rhetoric around this. I mean, I've heard pastors behind pulpits even say we should repeal the 19th Amendment because giving women the right to vote has some place of authority within our society. I think that's extreme and not at all what Paul's trying to talk about. I think he got a bad rap. And there's a lot of people who decide not to follow Jesus because they think Paul's a sexist. When in fact, I think he's actually a countercultural, radical changer of women within society due to this text. Men and women both need to form the character of a disciple together so as to not teach false teachings, not false knowledge, which leads to destruction of not only themselves, but to the community itself. Now for the ending. Probably the weirdest verse in the Bible. But women, or she, will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness with self-control. Okay, so we have this passage that's kind of sandwiched between two syncretisms of women, what we know are very pertinent to the Ephesian church. Because the majority of the false teachings in Ephesus were syncretisms. Syncretism is just when you have a lot of different thought molding together. And this was a big problem in the early church. This is why a lot of the Jewish believers were afraid to bring in Gentile believers, because it was a different culture, different set of beliefs, long rooted in tradition and how the cities are to function. This was a huge friction in the early church, one we don't necessarily see as much today. But we see how it affected Ephesus in Acts 19. Acts 19, where they're all shouting, "Great is Artemis I can't remember the exact word, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." And it causes a riot. It causes socioeconomic troubles. And in fact, Paul has to leave the city or else he might get killed. Right? There was a lot of secretism happening. There was a lot of upheaval and chaotic things happening in Ephesus at this time. So Paul brings a solution to this syncretism. Especially if you look at verse 9, I think the big point there is probably the braided hair, which I think if you read that, you're probably like, this is a weird thing, right? Braided hair. This is a statue from the first century of the goddess Artemis. Okay, so you could imagine hundreds, if not thousands of these things in the city. And if you notice something very unique about her hair, it's braided, isn't it? The prohibition against braided hair does have a socio-economic component to it, kind of the elitism of the top 1% of women in the church. Not all women are going to be doing this. Right? No slave woman has this type of hair because it requires slaves to do it. It's a very rich person problem. Right? But it's also a deep-rooted identity to the goddess or pagan deity of the city. In this case, probably Artemis. Dr. Gary Hogue, who wrote a commentary on what's called the Ephesiaca, it's a study of a Zenon of Ephesus who's writing at the first century. And he says this about this idea of braided hair. He says, for a woman to decide to dress modestly, to cease wearing the coiffure, the braided hair, and clothing associated with the goddess, and to perform deeds that show her piety toward God, would ultimately put her life at risk. Failure to promote the prevailing heresy of false teaching would constitute a breaking in the cultic law of the goddess. So you have a real sociological pressure on the early women of the Ephesian church, I think of any Gentile city, to not conform to the social norms of the city, which in the case of Artemis would have been to have elaborate, beautiful, braided hair, jewels, and expensive clothes. That would have been the expectation for women in their station. And Paul says that is not how you're supposed to be known. Be known for your good deeds, be benefactors of the poor in your worship to Christ. This is not only against the socioeconomic side, but don't be identified by those things anymore. And I think we see the same thing in verse 15. Because childbearing, as it is today, is probably one of the scariest things a young girl will ever go through. Especially in the first century, this is where most women died. And so if you have a cultural idea within the city that where Artemis is the goddess of child labor, who you would sacrifice to and worship, and you would have a huge part of your life, all through life, and then this Jesus movement comes in and says, hey, you have to denounce all those gods and have Jesus as your one true God, they would have had a real hard pressure on them to say, okay, well, I'm pregnant, and I'm afraid that if I don't worship Artemis, I'm going to die. I get that. And so verse 15 are comforting words to these women. In fact, we know the false teaching was a part of this. They were afraid to get married. They refused to get married. They refused to have children because of things like this. I think Paul's words are comforting to these women. He's advocating for them to know that Jesus is far better than Artemis. You don't need to add Jesus to your pantheon. That Jesus is sufficient, more than even Artemis. Dr. Gary Hogue says this about this passage. He says, women who chose to serve God rather than the goddess of childbearing would put their lives at risk because of the possibility of the wrath of the goddess. 1 Timothy 2:15 offered hope in place of fear for Ephesian women in God's church, despite the tremendous social and religious pressures in this setting. The character of a follower of Jesus, we have to wade through some of the cultural, societal pressures of our day, especially women sometimes have this. And Paul's talking about being known differently, but not being afraid to reject some of the social, economical customs of our day and say, be known for your faith in the one true Lord. Be known not for what you wear and how you identify with other things in this world, but by your good deeds as one who is devoted to Christ. The hope that just is saturated in that should never be dismissed. So the question at be, are we okay with women church leaders? I don't know how we stop them, to be honest with you. It's definitely not this passage. Right? I just can't come to that conclusion based on these things. And so I think the idea that we're talking about here with men and women joining hands together, directing and influencing the church, complementing one another, seems to be the more biblical approach. We're not over one another. We're standing side by side under the one true King Jesus, leading and directing and influencing the direction of the church. But I could be wrong. You could be wrong. But this seems to be the best information that I can give you.